She thought I was finished. She thought a 63-year-old man with a bad knee and a broken heart had nothing left to fight with. She was wrong about a lot of things, but that one cost her everything. My name is not important. What matters is that for 31 years, I built something from nothing in the hill country of central Tennessee. A lumber supply business that started with 2 trucks and a handshake and grew into something my father would have been proud of. I did it with my son Daniel, standing next to me from the time he was 12 years old and tall enough to stack boards in the yard. He was my partner before he was old enough to drive. He was my best friend before either of us knew what that meant. Daniel was 34 when he married Renata. I remember the first time he brought her home. She walked into my kitchen wearing a smile that arrived slightly before she did, if you know what I mean. The kind of smile that is doing a job. I noticed it the way you notice a small crack in a foundation. You tell yourself it is probably nothing, and you keep telling yourself that right up until the wall comes down. I did not say anything to Daniel. He was happy in a way I had not seen in years, and a father who loves his son learns when to keep his mouth shut. They got married on a Saturday in October. The leaves were turning. The light was the color of honey. I stood at the front of that church and I watched my boy cry when she walked down the aisle, and I decided right then that whatever I had seen in that smile was a mistake. I decided to love her because he loved her. That is what you do. For 2 years, things were fine on the surface. Renata worked in real estate. She was smart, organized, always dressed like she was about to close a deal. She and Daniel had a house about 40 minutes from my place, a nice piece of property on the edge of a reservoir. They seemed happy. I came for Sunday dinners. I kept my opinions to myself. Then my grandson was born. They named him Cody. I want to be careful here because what happened later does not change what I felt the first time I held that boy. He was 6 pounds, 14 ounces, and he had Daniel's ears and the most serious expression I have ever seen on a 2-hour-old human being. I sat in that hospital chair with him in my arms, and I told him that his grandfather was going to be there for every single thing that mattered in his life. I meant every word of it. The trouble started slowly, the way it always does when someone is patient and deliberate about what they want. Renata began making comments about the business. Not attacking it directly, she was too careful for that. It would be something offhand at dinner. Daniel works so hard and the margins on lumber have been so tight lately, haven't they? Or she would ask me questions that sounded like curiosity but were really measurements. How much is the Route 9 yard worth? What does the equipment inventory look like? Is the commercial property owned outright, or is there a note on it? I answered honestly because I had no reason not to. She was my daughter-in-law. She was the mother of my grandson. I was still deciding to love her. About 8 months after Cody was born, Daniel came to my office on a Tuesday afternoon and sat down across from my desk like a man who had been rehearsing something. He told me that Renata thought it might make sense for him to be added formally to the business ownership structure. Equal partnership. He said they had talked to an attorney. I looked at my son for a long time. He did not look away, but he looked like something that had been folded slightly against its natural crease. I told him I needed to think about it. What I actually did was call my own attorney, a man named Gerald, who had handled my affairs for 20 years. Gerald listened to everything, and then he said something I have never forgotten. He said, "Ray, there is a difference between a family member joining a business and a position being taken inside a family." I did not fully understand what he meant until later, but I wrote it down. I told Daniel I would consider a formal role for him with a proper buyout structure over time, but that I was not prepared to transfer equity based on a conversation. He nodded like a man who had expected that answer and already knew what came next. 3 weeks later, Daniel had a stroke. He was 37 years old. He was in perfect health. He ran 4 miles 3 times a week and had not missed a physical in a decade. The doctors told me it was a cryptogenic stroke, meaning they could not identify the cause. He was at his desk at home when it happened. Renata called me from the hospital, and her voice was flat in a way I registered somewhere below my conscious mind, the way you register a smell that is wrong before you can name it. I drove to that hospital in 22 minutes. I sat in that waiting room for 6 hours. The surgeon came out and told me they had done everything they could. My son was gone. I do not have language for what the next 72 hours felt like. I do not think language exists for it. I moved through those days the way water moves through sand, not really moving, just disappearing. The morning after the funeral, I drove to Daniel and Renata's house to help with whatever needed helping with. I had Cody's favorite snacks in a bag. He was 2.5, and he did not understand what had happened, and every time he said, "Daddy," my chest cracked open again from the inside. Renata answered the door. She was dressed, composed, and wearing an expression I recognized from real estate transactions. She looked at me and said, "Ray, I think it is better if you call before you come over from now on." I told her I was there to help with Cody. She said Cody was fine and that she had things handled. She started to close the door. I put my hand on the frame. Not aggressively. I just was not ready to have a door closed in my face the day after I buried my son. I told her I was not there to cause trouble. I just wanted to see my grandson. She looked at me with that smile, the original one, the one doing a job. She said, "Ray, Daniel did not leave the business to you. He left his half of everything to me. That includes decisions about who Cody spends time with. I think you need to speak to an attorney." I stood on that porch for a moment. My knee was aching. The air smelled like wood smoke from somewhere down the road. I said, very quietly, "Daniel did not have half the business. I never transferred equity." She said, "That is not what his will says." Then she closed the door. I sat in my truck for a long time before I could drive. The first thing I did when I got home was call Gerald. I told him what Renata had said about the will. Gerald was quiet for a moment, and then he said he would need to see the document. He told me to do nothing, say nothing, and touch nothing until we had spoken again. 2 days later, Gerald called me back. His voice had changed. He was careful, deliberate, the way a doctor is careful when the news requires precision. He told me that a will had been filed with the probate court, dated 14 months earlier, in which Daniel bequeathed his personal property, the house, his life insurance policy, and a 30% interest in Cumberland Valley Lumber to Renata. Gerald said the document appeared to be properly executed and notarized. I told Gerald that Daniel had never told me anything about this document. Gerald said that in his experience, when a spouse is unaware of a significant estate document, it is worth asking who prepared it and who was present at the signing. The notary on the document was a woman named Patricia Elaine Durwood. I had never heard of her. Gerald ran her license number. She had been notarizing documents in the Nashville area for 11 years. Nothing unusual. But her business address was a shared office suite on Charlotte Avenue that housed, among other small businesses, the real estate brokerage where Renata had worked for 3 years before she left to get her independent license. I wrote that down too. Here is what I have learned about grief. It does not make you weak the way people assume. It makes you very, very quiet. And in that quiet, if you pay attention, you start to hear things clearly for the first time. I started paying attention. I went back through everything. Every conversation I could remember between Daniel and Renata in the last year of his life. Every comment about money, about the business, about the future. I thought about the way Daniel had sat across from my desk that Tuesday afternoon with that folded crease expression. I thought about how he had never once, in all the years we worked together, made a financial move without talking it through with me first. Not once. I hired a private investigator. His name was Clint, former sheriff's deputy, mid-50s, the kind of man who speaks in complete sentences and does not use unnecessary words. I told him I wanted to know about Renata's life before Daniel. I wanted to know about her finances, her relationships, and I wanted to know if there was anyone in her life named Marcus. I chose Marcus because 3 months before Daniel died, I had gone to the house unannounced. This was before the door-closing era, and there had been a car in the driveway I did not recognize. When I knocked, there was a pause that was slightly too long before Renata answered. She was alone when she came to the door. The car was still there. I did not ask about it. I had been deciding to love her for too long to trust my own instincts. Clint came back to me in 3 weeks. He sat across from me at my kitchen table with a manila folder and the expression of a man who has seen enough of the world to not be surprised by any of it. He told me that Renata had a relationship that predated her marriage to Daniel by approximately 2 years with a man named Marcus Talley. Marcus worked in residential property development. He and Renata had overlapped professionally and personally. The relationship had not ended when she married Daniel. It had simply gone quiet. Clint put a photograph on my table. It was taken 11 days after my son's funeral. Renata and Marcus Talley, outside a restaurant in East Nashville, her hand on his arm, both of them laughing. My son had been in the ground for 11 days. Clint had more. He had traced a series of financial transfers from an account in Renata's name to a joint account that she and Marcus held at a credit union in Murfreesboro. The transfers had begun approximately 8 months before Daniel's stroke. The same month, Daniel had come to my office about the equity discussion. I looked at Clint and I asked him the question I had been afraid to ask anyone. I said, "Do you think my son's death was natural?" Clint looked at me for a long time. He said, "I think that question belongs to people with badges and subpoena power. What I can tell you is that you have enough here to get their attention." I took everything to Gerald that same afternoon. Gerald read through the file carefully. Then he made 2 calls while I sat in his office. The first was to a probate litigation attorney he trusted. The second was to a detective with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation named Diane Forsyth, who had handled a financial fraud case Gerald had been involved in 4 years earlier. I want to be precise about what happened next because I have told this story a few times and people always want it to move faster than it actually moved. The truth is that justice is slow. It is tedious. It involves a great deal of waiting in offices and answering the same questions multiple times and signing documents that take an hour to read. If you are looking for the moment the trap snapped shut, you will have to be patient. So was I. Detective Forsyth opened a preliminary inquiry into Daniel's death and the financial transfers. The medical examiner agreed to review the case file given the new information about the life insurance timeline and the transfers. Clint continued working. Gerald's probate attorney, a woman named Sandra Chu, filed a formal challenge to the will on grounds of undue influence and potential fraud in execution. Renata, to her credit, did not panic visibly. She hired an attorney. She sent me a certified letter through her counsel, informing me that she was seeking to limit my contact with Cody to supervised visits pending the resolution of the estate dispute. She said, in the careful language of legal correspondence, that she believed my attempts to contest the will were motivated by financial interest and were causing emotional disruption to a grieving child. I read that letter 3 times. The part about the grieving child. This was the lowest point. Not the grief of losing Daniel that was always there, a weight I had learned to carry, but the idea that I might lose Cody too, that I might become a quarterly visit, a card at Christmas, a man who faded from my grandson's life the same way the photograph of someone fades when you leave it in the sun too long. I want to be honest about something. I thought about giving up. Not because I believed Renata was right, but because fighting takes energy that grief has already taken from you, and there are mornings when you are 63 years old and your son is gone and your knee hurts and the house is very quiet, and you think that maybe it would be easier to let the wolves have whatever they came for and just find a way to live with what is left. I did not give up. I want to be clear about that. But I understand the men who do, and I do not judge them. What brought me back, every time, was something very simple. I would think about Daniel at 12 years old, stacking boards in the lumber yard, asking me questions about board feet and moisture content with the seriousness of a graduate student. I would hear his voice, and I would get up. 6 months after Daniel died, Sandra Chu deposed the notary, Patricia Elaine Durwood. Durwood lasted 45 minutes before she started crying. She said that Renata had been referred to her by a mutual contact and had come to her office with the document and a man she introduced as her husband. The man had signed the document in front of Durwood. Durwood had notarized it. She said she had not asked for ID beyond what was presented, and that the man had known Daniel's full name and birth date. She said she was sorry. She said she had not known what the document was for. She said she had a daughter, Cody's age. The man who had signed as Daniel had been identified through the office building's parking lot camera footage. It was Marcus Talley. Marcus Talley was arrested on a Tuesday. Renata was arrested on a Thursday, after her attorney declined a cooperation offer that Sandra Chu later told me was the most favorable deal she had seen offered in a fraud case in 15 years. The charges included forgery, fraudulent execution of a will, wire fraud related to the financial transfers, and a conspiracy count that would take another 8 months to fully develop as the investigation into Daniel's death continued. I will not speculate here about where that investigation ultimately led. That is a matter of public record, and I will let it remain there. What I will tell you about is the morning the estate was formally settled. Sandra Chu had asked me to come to her office on a Wednesday in March. It was raining the way it rains in Tennessee in early spring, gray and steady and purposeful. I had driven past the lumber yard on the way. The Route 9 location, the one I had built first, the one Daniel had grown up in. The sign was still there, Cumberland Valley Lumber. The letters were the same ones I had put up 26 years ago. Sandra's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown. She had a conference table with 8 chairs, and that morning there were 4 of us. Sandra, Gerald, me, and a younger attorney from Sandra's firm who handled the document work. On the table there was a folder and 2 pens and a cup of coffee that Sandra had made sure was there before I arrived, because she is that kind of person. Sandra walked me through the settlement. The fraudulent will had been voided. The estate reverted to intestate succession under Tennessee law, which meant that Daniel's assets passed to his surviving spouse and child. But Renata, having been charged with fraud related to Daniel's death, was subject to the Slayer Rule provisions that Sandra had successfully argued applied to the broader pattern of financial conduct. The life insurance policy, which had named Renata as sole beneficiary and had been the centerpiece of the original scheme, was being contested by the insurer based on the fraud findings. The house was tied up in litigation. What was not tied up was the business. Cumberland Valley Lumber had never formally transferred any equity to Daniel because I had never executed that transfer. What Daniel had had was a verbal partnership and 31 years of shared work and his name on the door of his office and a coffee mug that still sat on his desk because I had not been able to make myself move it. The business was mine. It had always been mine. Sandra slid the folder across the table. I looked at the documents for a while before I picked up the pen. I thought about all the mornings Daniel and I had driven to that yard before 6 o'clock, the sky still purple over the hills, the smell of cut pine in the cold air. I thought about the questions he used to ask. I thought about how good he was at the work, better than me in some ways, and how proud that had made me. I signed where Sandra indicated. Then I sat back in my chair and looked out the window at the rain. Now, I want to tell you the part that people do not expect. After the settlement, after the criminal proceedings were underway, after the fraudulent will was void and the business was secured, and Renata and Marcus were facing the consequences of what they had done after all of that, I had to make a decision about Cody. Cody was 3 years old. He did not know what fraud meant. He did not know what a notary was. He did not know that the man who had occasionally been at his house was not his father's friend. He knew that his daddy was gone, and that his grandpa had been coming to see him every week at the arrangement the family court had ordered during the estate proceedings, and that his grandpa always brought goldfish crackers and always sat on the floor with him to build things, and that was the whole of his world. Renata's mother, a woman named Claudette who lived in Bowling Green, had filed for emergency custody of Cody the week after the arrests. I had never had a problem with Claudette. She was a quiet woman who had made her own peace with whatever her daughter had become. She loved that boy. I had seen it. The question before me was whether I would contest Claudette's custody petition or file my own. I will be honest. My attorney thought I had a reasonable case for grandparent visitation rights and potentially more, given the circumstances. Sandra told me I could fight for Cody and that I had grounds. I thought about it for a long time. Weeks, actually. I drove out to the reservoir one evening, the one near the house where Daniel and Renata had lived, and I sat on the bank for about an hour watching the water. The house was in foreclosure proceedings at that point, empty, the windows dark. Here is what I decided. Cody needed stability. He needed a home that was not a courtroom, a childhood that was not depositions and custody hearings and adults speaking in careful tones about things he could not understand. Claudette could give him that. She had a house in Bowling Green, a routine, a life that was quiet and ordinary, and exactly what a 3-year-old boy who had lost his father needed. I was 63 years old with a bad knee in a lumber business and a grief that would be with me for the rest of my life. I could fight for that boy. I had fought for harder things. But I asked myself whether fighting was what he needed or whether it was what I needed. And those are not the same question. I did not contest Claudette's petition. I called her instead. We talked for a long time. I told her I wanted to stay in Cody's life. I told her I wanted to be his grandfather, not a legal filing. I told her I would drive to Bowling Green whenever she thought it was appropriate, and I would not make it complicated. and I would not use that boy to process my own pain. Claudette was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Ray, I think Daniel would have appreciated that." I told her I hoped so. The arrangement we made is simple. I see Cody twice a month. I bring goldfish crackers. We sit on the floor and build things. He is 4 now, and he has started asking about his father. In the careful way 4-year-olds ask about things that are too large for them, circling the edges of something they cannot see the full shape of yet. I tell him his father was the best person I have ever known. I tell him his father loved him more than the whole world. I tell him his father used to ask a lot of questions, and that is a very good quality to have. Cody thinks about this very seriously, and then usually asks for more goldfish crackers. The business is doing well. I hired a good operations manager last fall, a young woman named Teresa who reminds me of Daniel in the way she thinks through problems. I come in most mornings before 6. The sky is still purple over the hills. The cut pine still smells the same in the cold air. I think about Daniel every day, not with the same sharp, breathless pain of the first year. It has changed into something that is always there. Like the sound of the river, when you live near enough to it, you stop noticing it consciously, but on quiet mornings you realize you have been hearing it all along. I kept his coffee mug on his desk. I do not know if I did everything right in all of this. I made choices that other people would not have made. I kept my mouth shut when I should have listened to my instincts. I waited too long to trust what I saw in that smile on the first day. I do not know if the outcome would have been different, if I had moved faster, or spoken sooner, or loved him in a different way. What I know is this. My son built something. He built it with me, and he built it in himself. The kind of man he was careful, serious, asking good questions, wanting to do things right. Renata could forge his signature. She could fabricate a document and present a stranger as my son in front of a notary, and move money into accounts he never knew existed. She could do all of that. What she could not do was take what he actually was, what he built, what he left. That belongs to Cody now, and to me. And to every morning I drive past that sign, and the letters are still the same ones I put up 26 years ago. She thought I was finished. She was wrong about a lot of things,